the USA reportedly absorbed thousands of Nazis to create U.S. intelligence after 1945. It seems to be a crucial piece of the geopolitical puzzle, and for basic understanding of what the U.S. ruling elite really want. Dr. Francisco Gil White from HearHome.com, or Historical and Investigative Research, joins me and talks about Washington's true leaning today and why it may not be so American or even so pro-Israel. I'm going to be covering this topic tonight. We invite you to call in. I'll give out our numbers again for you all from the USA and Canada. Write it down, 1-888-780-2425. From Israel, 02997-2425. We want to know, do you agree, disagree, have a question, a comment? We want to hear from you. And again, during the interview, you can go to the website of Dr. Francisco Gil White at HIR-HOME.com, HearHome.com. Welcome to the show, Dr. Francisco Gil White.
Tamar, it's always a pleasure to be on your show, and I always hate to correct you, but the name of the website is HIRHome.com with no dash.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm glad you corrected me.
No problem.
All right. So you are in the midst of writing a book, and one of the features, the chapters that you are working on right now is about Nazis being brought to the United States after World War II and what happened with them and how they were being used. So why don't you, where would you like to start? Because this all leads up to where we are today in 2012 and what we're seeing happening and unfolding in politics and in globalism today. So go ahead.
I believe so, yeah. So, well, first we should probably start with a general misconception that exists about this topic in the minds of a great many people, which has to do with how the media has treated the topic. What many people who are relatively well educated believe they know about the recruitment of Nazis after World War II is that the U.S. recruited a few Nazi scientists in an operation that a number of people are familiar with, which is Operation Paperclip, and used those Nazis to develop nuclear weapons and develop rockets to deliver them, and so on and so forth. But in fact, although that is true, and a number of Nazi scientists were recruited to work in the United States, this obscures the fact that, because this is what people talk about and this is what has been mentioned in the media, people don't know that, in fact, tens of thousands and perhaps hundreds of thousands of Nazi war criminals and their collaborators were recruited in secret for different purposes of U.S. intelligence.
Okay, so some people might argue, well, why shouldn't the U.S. try to, absorb the brains of Europe and, it's kind of like the booty of war and use it towards their advantage? What would you say?
Well, I think that the problem with that kind of argument is that in that case, why did we fight the war at all? I mean, why not just sign the peace with the Nazis? If Nazis are not objectionable in the U.S. intelligence services, then why are they objectionable as the masters of Europe? Because in fact, one of the things that was done with these Nazis after the war was that U.S. intelligence, allied with the Vatican, worked to dress them up in suits and ties, called them Christian Democrats, and returned the same fascists and the same Nazis to rule the governments of Europe in the guise of Christian democratic parties. And in fact, in the post-war years, pretty much all of Western Europe was ruled by Christian democratic parties that were functioning as covers for the erstwhile fascists and Nazis that were now tightly controlled by U.S. intelligence. So,
can you give us an example?
Sure. I'll give you the most dramatic example of all. The process of recruiting Nazis after the war began with something that is called the Gehlen Org. The Gehlen Org is short for the Gehlen Organization, which was centered around Reinhard Gehlen, who had been chief of Nazi intelligence for Hitler's foreign armies east. So what happened was, after the war, there was obviously an official obligation of the U.S. military to find Nazi war criminals, arrest them, and then have them prosecuted. But although this happened in the cases of a token few, the great majority of the war criminals that were identified by the Army Intelligence Services and were interrogated by them were recruited, beginning with Reinhard Gehlen, to what became the Gehlen Org. So Reinhard Gehlen began recreating for the United States the entire network of Nazi intelligence that had been used in the East, in the Eastern European countries occupied by the Nazis, and it was a system that relied on the recruitment of a vast army of collaborators of all different sorts, who in fact participated in some of the dirtiest work of the Holocaust. So, with the sponsorship of U.S. intelligence and the U.S. military, Reinhard Gehlen began recreating this vast network of spies and war criminals. And in the year 1956, the U.S. ordered that the Gehlen Org become the official intelligence service of Western Germany, the Bundesnachrichtendienst.
All right, so I'm just trying to figure this out. So if America absorbed these thousands of Nazis, who won? In other words, did America win because they got the brains and they got to use whatever they wanted to use from these people who were extremely useful to America? Or wait a second, just a second. Or was it the opposite? Did they take over the American government and now they're, pulling the strings?
Yeah, I realize this seems like a reasonable question, but as I have pointed out before, when we construct English language sentences where America is the subject of the sentence and performs an action, we are already talking nonsense. So any answer to that question would be nonsense. America doesn't win. America doesn't lose. There are millions of people living in the United States. They do not make decisions. They do not win or lose or get their purposes enacted into state action. The people who do that are a very small number of people who run the government. Now, let us call these people the U.S. ruling class, which is not only the people actually in government, but also it includes people who run the biggest industries in the United States.
Corporations.
They're the corporate ruling class, which uses government as one of its appendages to get what they want, right? Now, those people, before World War II, were leading a movement that became a worldwide movement called eugenics. They were also, remember, these are the same people who were in control of the U.S. government and the state governments. Before World War II, the policies that would later become identified with German Nazism flourished in the United States. Before there was ever eugenic sterilization in Germany, it flourished in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people in the United States were forcibly sterilized or incarcerated because they didn't have the right Aryan Germanic genes. This has been erased from historical consciousness because it is not really taught in schools, although it is perfectly well documented, and you can find it in history books in any library. But ordinary, well-educated United States citizens know almost nothing about eugenics because it is not part of the curriculum. So to give you just one example, when I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, I would always do this experiment. I would ask my students this is an Ivy League school, so we're talking about supposedly some of the best educated young people in the country. and I would ask them before I began my college-level course if anybody could raise their hands if they had ever heard the word eugenics. I was not even requiring them to understand it deeply, just to be familiar with the term. Nobody moved. Mm-hmm. Now, if modern, well-educated people don't know about the eugenics movement, then they cannot possibly begin to comprehend why the U.S. ruling class recruited the Nazi espionage and war criminal infrastructure after the war. Because what they are missing is the key piece of the puzzle, that the ideology of German Nazism was first promoted by the ruling class in Britain and in the United States. And in fact, the financing to build that same infrastructure in Germany, which then became the German Nazi Party, that financing and the ideology and even the legal precedents came from the United States. Hitler, for his eugenic sterilization and incarceration program in Germany, which was prior to the actual Holocaust, he copied the legal precedents that had been established in the United States for forcible sterilization and incarceration of people who were deemed subhumans for not being intelligent according to the standards of phony IQ tests that the people from the eugenics movement invented.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I remember seeing some type of documentary. I don't remember if it was the History Channel or where, and they were talking about, I think it was the Kellogg family, you know, the Kellogg cereal, possibly, and how they were running these health farms and how he was practicing or trying to push forward the idea of eugenics, of depopulation of the world. And people should not take my...
People were.
Okay. A lot of people were, but they
specifically,
in the
elite were doing
if I remember correctly, mentioned him, and I was shocked because I said, hey, that's, you know, Kellogg's cereal, you know. But I urge people to check it out because my memory is not the greatest in the world either. All right, one more thing I wanted to say that will actually support what you're saying, and where you're talking about the corporate ruling class, and that is, I remember reading online articles or information, a documentary about how the 100 richest entities in the world are not countries or nations, but they're corporations. And if that's the case, then that would support what you're saying, where that the governments aren't always so sovereign or independent, but if a corporation is richer and more powerful than a country is, so who really is calling the shots there? I mean, who owns who?
Well, I think the proper model is that the people who run the biggest corporations in the world actually use governments as appendages to get much of what they need. And so governments appear to be independent of these corporate structures, but in fact they are not. Let me give you just one example of how this works. The National Security Act of 1947 was the law that Congress authorized that led to the creation of the CIA. This is where modern U.S. intelligence was created. National Security Act of 1947. Now, the National Security Act, and this is, remember, when the entire recruitment of the Nazi war criminal infrastructure is going on behind the scenes. The National Security Act of 1947 authorizes U.S. intelligence to initiate any action at any moment without asking anybody. Moreover, any report of such activity may be postponed for an indeterminate period of time by making simply the argument that any such report would damage the quote-unquote national security interests of the United States. So, in essence, the National Security Act of 1947 gave U.S. intelligence absolute power to do anything it wants. Of course, anything it wants within the confines of the budget for U.S. intelligence, because you can't do things that you don't have money for. But it turns out that the U.S. intelligence budget is state secret, and therefore, for all practical purposes, it is unlimited, because we're talking about the richest country on earth. So And another thing that is true about U.S. intelligence is that the people who run it come from the United States' richest families. So what you have here is a mechanism where the richest people in the United States created a government agency that can do anything it wants and spend unlimited amounts of money that it is in fact collecting through the Treasury from ordinary U.S. citizens. So ordinary U.S. citizens give their wealth to the U.S. Treasury, and a great amount of that money is used by the richest families in the United States to further their own political agenda. Because with that money, they can corrupt the press, they can corrupt the political structure, they can corrupt the news media, and so on and so forth, and they can do the same thing in other countries. In fact, the National Security Act of 1947 explicitly authorizes the U.S. government to corrupt the government, media, political, economic, financial processes in other countries.
I want to make a correction of what I said. I had said that the top 100 largest or richest entities in the world were corporations. Let me correct what I said. It says here online, of the world's 100 largest economic entities, 51 are now corporations and 49 are countries. So that is the correct information. I apologize for my lack of memory. And according to the American Eugenics Society, which was established, as you said, in 1922 to promote eugenics in the United States, part of the people that helped to finance, it's listed here in Wikipedia as John H. Kellogg, who started the Kellogg Cereal Company. So people can look that up for themselves and not have to trust what I'm saying, because I don't have such a great memory. All right. So in another minute, we're going to be going to a break. So how would you like to take us in other words, end this segment and take us to the next step for when we come back after the break? Okay. Well, I would wrap it up this way. The answer to the question, who won the war, is the Western ruling classes. The Western ruling classes won the war, even though they failed in some of their objectives, because I believe one of their objectives was the destruction of communist Soviet Union, and in that they failed. But they certainly didn't lose control. So the same Nazis that they had been sponsoring before World War II ended up in power all over Western Europe after World War II. Of course, now they pretended to be Democrats and so forth, but behind the scenes they were preparing the ground for the next assault on Western liberties. And I believe, as you said, that the politics we are seeing all over the world is the maturing of that process, and it won't be long now before all of the gains of the French Revolution are permanently destroyed. Well, that's pretty scary and pretty opens up a Pandora's box here for the next segment. I want to, again, remind all of our listeners that it's a live show if you're listening between 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, or if it's between 9 to 10 p.m. Holy Time right here in the land of Israel. You can call in with a question, with a comment. Do you agree? Do you disagree? We want to hear from you. Again, in the USA and Canada, 1-888-780-2425. In Israel, 02-997-2425. Or you can go to our webpage at israelnationalradio.com, click on the tab that says schedule, and you'll find all of our numbers there. We'd love to hear from you, so call in. Now's the time to do it. And we're speaking with Dr. Francisco Gil-White from HearHome.com. Check it out during the break. We'll be right back.
My name is Quentin Ireland from Orlando, Florida. Just coming to see God's land and God's people. I have seen a great many people with the courage. They're saying this is the land that God gave us and following His mandates.
I'm Bart Nuboer, I'm Dutch. I'm here the 5th time in Israel. I felt in Jerusalem that there was something that drew me there to the wall especially. That's why I'm coming back.
You're listening to Israel National Radio, spreading the light of Israel around the world.
Israel National Radio presents News, Views, and Call-Ins with Tamar Yonah.
The USA reportedly absorbed thousands of Nazis to create U.S. intelligence after 1945, after World War II. And it seems to be a crucial piece of the geopolitical puzzle and for basic understanding of what the U.S. ruling elite really want. Our guest today is Dr. Francisco Gil White from HereHome.com, historical and investigative research, and he's joining me and talking about Washington's true leaning today and why it may not be so American or so pro-Israel either. We welcome your calls to comment, to agree, disagree, ask a question. Our number is 1-888-780-2425 from the USA and Canada. Again, 1-888-780-2425, and from Israel, 02-997-2425. All right, so America takes in Nazis after World War II. It is now the year 2012. The American economy tanking, the world economy tanking, the European Union being formed, now having trouble, Israel being asked to cut itself, to bleed itself to death by giving up territory to appease terrorists. And it doesn't look like we're in any enlightened age at all. So where is this all going now?
Well, I think it's headed towards another Holocaust. I've been saying that for 8 years now, 9 years. I think that's where it's going. And the only way it can be avoided, in my view, is if the Jews of the world really believe it. Because the last time they were easily killed precisely because they couldn't or wouldn't believe that this was going to happen. It can be prevented, I think. I think we're still in time. But not if people bury their heads in the sand and continue to believe that the U.S. is the best friend of Israel and that has the best interests of Israel at heart. The cold, hard-headed analysis of geopolitical realities leads to a very different conclusion. Remember, foreign policy is essentially hatched in the intelligence services. If those intelligence services were created by absorbing a great ocean of Nazi war criminals, then it would indeed be surprising if U.S. foreign policy were designed to protect the Jewish state. I would suggest that the reality is exactly the opposite. But let me just give you a little detail here that helps us better understand the world we live in.
Okay.
I'm going to quote you something that was written in the Washington Post in 1988 in reaction to the investigative research of historian Christopher Simpson, in whose book, Blowback, the Recruitment of Nazis into the U.S. and its Effects in the Cold War, he documented precisely what we've been discussing, the recruitment of the Nazi war criminal infrastructure into U.S. intelligence. And the Washington Post wrote, in reaction to Simpson's research, the following, quote, "It is no longer necessary nor possible to deny the facts. The government of the United States systematically and deliberately recruited active Nazis by the thousands, rescued them, and employed them." End of quote. Now, where would you say, Tamar, that a statement of this kind, revealing news of this drama, should have been published? On what page of the Washington Post?
Well, it should be front page news. What page was it on?
It should be front page news. If we were living in a world where there is a free market of information, the Washington Post would have written this on the front page. It would have been the leading article after the publication of Simpson's book. In fact, it was relegated to the back pages in a tiny little literary review. All that Simpson got was a tiny book review in the Washington Post. Practically nobody saw this. The New York Times did the same. So did the rest of the Western media. Now, this was a very different behavior from the behavior of the same media services a few years, just a couple years before, when Alan Ryan, employed by the Department of Justice, I believe, had published a exoneration of U.S. intelligence. Why did Alan Ryan do this? Because in France, they were trying Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, Gestapo SS leader in France, right, responsible for murdering scores of Jews and other unfortunate people. And Klaus Barbie had been arrested by the Bolivian government. He had been hiding out in Bolivia and had been sent out to France. And in France, well, they were forced to try him. And in the trial, it came out that he had been working for the United States for U.S. intelligence. So that scandal caused the U.S. Department of Justice to publish Alan Ryan's quote-unquote investigation, in which Alan Ryan concluded, in quotes, that Barbie had been the only case of the U.S. Intelligence services recruiting a Nazi war criminal. And they had done it without really knowing who he was, and hadn't understood what they were doing, and they hadn't done this with anybody else. And that was it. Now, this was the year of 1983. When Alan Ryan published his exoneration of U.S. intelligence, saying that Barbie had been the only one, he was invited to sit on ABC News Nightline with Ted Koppel to explain how Barbie had been the only case and the CIA's hands were clean except for this one case, and so on and so forth. He received an enormous amount of press. And the press didn't skeptically challenge Ryan. They just became the platform for him to repeat that the CIA's hands were clean except for this one case. When Christopher Simpson in 1988 published a refutation of Ryan, a very detailed refutation with a mountain of documents that had become available through the Freedom of Information Act, still heavily censored, but in any case sufficient to establish the tip of a huge iceberg having to do with the massive recruitment of thousands, tens of thousands of Nazis. The media said nothing, or the equivalent. They gave Christopher Simpson a tiny book review that almost nobody saw. The news was not reported on the front page of the papers. He was not invited to discuss it on Nightline with Ted Koppel. He didn't appear on CNN, and so on and so forth. Practical, total silence.
Okay,
this,
so
I think, is very telling of how the world works.
Where is this undercurrent of power showing itself today? Where do they want to take the world today? And do they really have the power to do so? I mean, if they've infiltrated and become strong in the intelligence agencies, so they can give this information that they want to give to the President of the United States, but ultimately other people will decide what to do with the information that or this intelligence. So how does it work?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
In other words, you're saying that they've basically taken over the intelligence community, and whatever intelligence they feed the government will influence their decisions, correct?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
No, okay.
You're making it sound as though the Nazis infiltrated the U.S. government. I gave you a very different picture. What I said was that the U.S. government, working as an appendage of the eugenicist U.S. ruling class, produced the Nazi movement in Germany in the first place, and then recruited its own Nazis after the war into its intelligence services.
Ah, okay.
So I'm not saying that anybody's getting duped by the Nazis. What I'm saying is that the Nazis' owners have always been the U.S. ruling elite. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. We have a question from a listener in the Philippines, Dale, and he's asking, where does Iran fit in with this Holocaust theory? He said he thinks...
That's an excellent question. Yeah, that's
Let me just continue. He said he thinks another Holocaust might be on the horizon. Is it coming from the West or Iran/Islam?
Okay. I think this is an excellent question, but I don't think the either-or helps us. I believe what's going on is the same kind of structure that was set up in the prelude to World War II. So in the prelude to World War II, you have these very rich Western industrialists, people like Rockefeller, Carnegie,
Ford,
the Harrimans, and so forth, creating the American eugenics movement, and then Henry Ford also, and then sending tremendous amounts of money over to Europe and especially to Germany to grow the eugenics movement there, and then to finance the people who helped create the German Nazi movement. So what the ordinary U.S. citizens saw was very different, however. What they saw was the sudden rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, which apparently bore no close connection to what was happening in the United States, And that the leader of that movement in public began to say that he was going to exterminate the European Jews. So when that extermination happened, and because of the participation of the U.S. with the Allies in World War II, it seemed as though the U.S. government was opposed to Nazi control of Europe and opposed to the Holocaust. And therefore, in the post-war years, it could claim to have saved Europe and to be the leader of the free world, quote unquote, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're having a similar, I think, structure being set up, because we have Iran playing the role of the German Nazis, saying in public that they will exterminate the Israeli Jews. The U.S. in public claims to be the enemy of Iran, and it claims to be a friend of Israel, when in fact, as you can see on hirhome.com, my website, we have documented with great care the entire history of U.S. Foreign policy towards Iran. And we have discussed this on other shows with you, Tamar. The entire history of U.S. foreign policy towards Iran has been one of support for Iran. When you ignore the public statements of enmity, the great Satan from Iran and the you guys are terrorists from the United States and so on and so forth, if you ignore that, which is cheap talk, it costs almost nothing to produce these public statements, and you focus on the behaviors that cost billions of dollars, which are the ones that really matter. Those are the ones that truly reveal what the U.S. ruling elite's preferences are. Then what you see is that invariably the significant behaviors of U.S. foreign policy have helped Iran. There is, for example, the famous case of the Iran-Contra scandal, when the U.S. was found to be sending billions of dollars in armament every year of the Iran-Iraq war to the Iranians. Another dramatic example is the recent invasion of Iraq. They didn't invade Iran, they invaded Iraq. And the consequence of invading Iraq, everybody agrees, is that Iraq has been handed over to the Iranians, thus bringing the Iranian border much closer to Israel. Right? So the effect of U.S. foreign policy over the past 30-something years, ever since the Ayatollah Khomeini took power, has been one of support for the Iranian Islamists in Iran. So the apparent picture is one of enmity. The actual picture, in terms of billions of dollars spent, is one of constantly undermining Israel and constantly supporting the regional goals of Iran.
Okay, so let's say that you're correct in all of what you're saying. My question to you is that maybe for Iran, it's cheap for them to say death to America, death to Israel, right? And it's rhetoric. But the people who are shouting it in the streets are not looking at it as rhetoric. They really believe it, and they really are enemies of the West. So how does that fit in?
Well, any political system and any political movement needs to mobilize the masses to a certain extent. And what you see in the streets of Iran is not necessarily a representative reflection of what most people in Iran believe. The only thing that matters is that it looks good on TV. And that is not really that important. What ordinary Iranians do or do not believe, do or do not think, do or do not hate, is not really that important. What matters is what the ruling class of that country intends to do. It's what they think, what they mean to do that really matters. And if they mean to drop an atomic bomb on Israel, then whatever the people on the streets are chanting is not what you should be paying attention to. So I think that's really where attention needs to be spent in geopolitical analysis.
Okay. Now, I am not calling the President of the United States a Nazi. However, some people have mentioned that some of his tactics when he was trying to get elected with his youth movements, it was kind of like the Hitler Youth, and the way that he would use intimidation with some of these. I'm not sure if it was the Black Panthers, but he had some type of blacks intimidating people when they went to vote. Today we see that Obama has the SS, the Secret Service, visiting people's homes if they say certain things unflattering or remotely, dangerous, for Obama. and people get knocks on their doors from the Secret Service today in America. They're watching your Facebook, etc. So, is this an overflow, a wave coming from this Nazi? These Nazis embedded in the American system, or is it just imagination? People just taking things too far in their imagination.
Again, I'm not really going to answer your question. I think the problem is with the premises inherent in your question. I think the attention that we pay to the personalities of presidents is entirely misplaced. Presidents come and go. Who cares? The foreign policy of the United States has been perfectly consistent, whether the successive administrations have been Republican or Democrat. They have invariably been undermining the security of Israel. They have invariably been supporting Iran, to name just two examples. So I think the focus on Obama is part of a theater of U.S. quote-unquote democratic politics that sucks people in. It's a circus for people to get excited about, interested in, and so on and so forth. And it distracts us from what's really going on. Obama doesn't matter. If what's his name, John McCain had been elected instead of Obama, the politics would have been exactly the same, just as the politics of the Bush Jr. administration were identical to Clinton's, and Clinton's were identical to Bush daddies, and so on and so forth down the line of time. So any attention to the personalities and specific actions or idiosyncrasies of the current sitting president, I think, entirely mislead us from the kind of analysis that we must do. Because in the National Security Act of 1947, U.S. intelligence was given complete and total power to do anything it wants in secret. Therefore, whoever is sitting in the White House is really just a tool of this syndicate that really runs pretty much everything, in my view.
Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left. So this ruling power elite, or ruling class, as you call it, this corporate ruling class, wants to take the world where? You say, you mentioned eugenics. They want to depopulate a lot of the worlds. They want to make a one-world government, a world with no more national sovereignties. They want to dissolve national sovereignties and make a one-world government?
I think national sovereignties are details. Either they will or they won't. What matters is that they attain the kind of power that they wish to have. If they can attain that kind of power with national states, with the facade of national states or without it, I think it's all the same to them, whatever works. The point is that what really matters, or what we should really focus on, is that they are enemies of individual civil liberties and human rights.
Okay, so what else do they want? What is their vision?
The achievements of the French Revolution for ordinary working people. And that's what they seek to destroy. And this is why, by the way, they have such a focus on destroying the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people is the historical origin of the ideas in favor of human liberty and the rights of ordinary working people. It's the law of Moses that introduced those ideas into Western political thought. And it was because those ideas were introduced into our thought that the process that we know as the European Enlightenment was allowed to come forward. And in fact, the Enlightenment emerges, as historians recognize, mostly from the thoughts of the most radical thinker in the most radical of all places, which in that time was Holland, and I'm speaking of Baruch Spinoza or Benedict Spinoza. It all comes from Jewish thought, because Spinoza was translating for a Christian educated audience the thoughts of Moses Maimonides. So here we have the Jewish tradition producing the political developments in Western history that allowed modern, liberal, parliamentary, democratic, republican states to emerge. Because the French Revolution is a consequence of the European Enlightenment. And it's the French Revolution that produced the possibility for these modern Western states. So if you are a member of the ruling classes of the West that wishes to take us back to a world of repression and slavery, then you understand that the Jewish tradition of liberal and pro-labor thinking is a tremendous threat to your entire project. And this is why these ruling classes have sought to massacre Jews and forcibly convert them and expel them from the countries that they rule.
Okay, so basically, are you saying it's like the Tower of Babel people against the Jewish people?
I don't know what the Tower of Babel is.
Meaning that these are people who are saying, we want to build a tower to reach the heavens, to dethrone God, and we will become the masters of our own destiny. We don't have to do what God wants. We will create our own morality, our own laws, our own rules, and dethrone God. And the Jewish people have the Torah.
I don't think these people even have to believe in God. My analysis is entirely political, and I think theirs is primarily so as well. I think these people want to stay in power. The kind of power they want to exercise requires depriving ordinary people of their rights, and the Jewish tradition of legal protections for ordinary freedoms and for ordinary working people and human rights stand in the way of their project. And therefore, ever since the Greco-Roman empires, which were slave-making empires, there have been massive killings of Jews. Because that tradition, the Greco-Roman tradition, which is still the tradition that informs the thinking of Western ruling elites, is fundamentally opposed to the liberty and the worship of basic human dignities that we see enshrined in the law of Moses.
Okay, so real quick. So does it matter who Americans vote for, Romney or
Not
Obama,
at all.
because they're
It's
both
all the
puppets?
same. Absolutely not. The best thing that U.S. citizens could do is declare a moratorium on the political process and all of them stay home, because then they would be voting against the system itself. The worst thing they can do is go vote as if there was a choice. There is no choice. None of these candidates, none of these parties really mean anything. They're just facades so that people will give their support to the system. Because once they go out and vote, they have said that they believe in the system. So the more they vote, the less it is possible to change it.
Well, certainly something to think about. Not enough time to cover, to give it fair coverage in this 1-hour radio show, but we very much appreciate you giving us something to think about. And again, people can find out more by going to hearhome.com, HIRHOME.com. Dr. Francisco Gil White, thank you for joining us and giving us this very special insight that we don't get to read about in the press. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Tamar.
All right, and I will be back tomorrow, same time, so join us. More good shows and news.